What does it mean when the healthiest person you know, the one who exercises daily, the one who eats right, the one who hydrates well, the one who lives with intention, gets diagnosed with cancer? And not just any cancer, but hormone-positive breast cancer. Dr. Shanhong Lu is that person. I am Dr. Manna, your friend and functional medicine doctor. Twice in my life, conventional medicine failed me, and now it is my passion to find the best health and wellness information and share it with you here. Dr. Shanhong Lu is not the only one getting diagnosed with breast cancer. More and more young Asian women are getting diagnosed. On the outside, they look healthy, they have everything one could want, and yet, the number of young Asian women getting diagnosed with breast cancer increases every day. What is the reason behind that? Dr. Shanhong Lu is a deeply thoughtful and courageous physician navigating a complex personal health journey and rethinking what we've long believed about cancer, hormones and hormone metabolism, environmental toxins, trauma, and immunity. Dr. Lu is a third-generation doctor. Her grandmother was a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, and her mother is a cardiologist and a professor of medicine. Dr. Lu herself is an MD and PhD in human physiology with a postdoc fellowship in the genetics of hypertension. In this conversation, we also explore the role of spike protein, how it might impact our immune system and lead to chronic disease. We will also talk about why rhythmic dosing of hormones for midlife women deserves a second look, and how emotional trauma lives in the body and can lead to a lot of illness. This is not just a clinical discussion, it's a call for a deep honesty in medicine, in science, in how we connect to each other, how we manage stress, and how we live with the toxins in our world. Welcome to our conversation. Welcome, Dr. Lu. It's my pleasure to have you here.
I'm very excited to have this session with you. You are so knowledgeable. You have interviewed, a big group of practitioners. And so I'm really, really excited to share some of the insights I have.
That's great. And as I mentioned, I already recorded your intro for this session, but I would love for you to tell us in your words how you would introduce yourself. Tell us about yourself.
Yes, I am Shanhong Lu. I have been passionately engaged in my practice with environmental medicine. Because after moving to Mount Shasta in 1998, I briefly was working in the ICU in the nursing home, and quickly I myself started having autoimmune challenges. And I was very, very intrigued why I was so healthy. I was 42 years old at that time. And I was just really curious, what is this all about? And in the past, I would say from 42 to 61, these 26 years of measuring people's toxicity level, looking at the genetics, looking at the interaction between the genes and the environment, I really become very, very concerned. Finally had the diagnosis of breast cancer myself, and that just completely pushed me to this place that I have nothing else to offer but really looking at the root cause, because we are seeing now young people, in their 20s and 30s having the diagnosis of colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, and even prostate cancer. And it's no longer old people disease. So in the past, I would say 20 years now, I'm gathering physicians. I actually just came back from a retreat we call Environmental Medicine Made Simple in Hawaii, and really just pointed to the direction, look, if we talk about longevity, anti-aging medicine, if we don't look at the detoxification and what's affecting our body's ability to receiving these wonderful technologies, and including hormone replacement, peptide, stem cell, exosome, all these things, if we don't detoxify, we will not be able to sustain the benefit of all the modern technologies on longevity, right? So that's really, to make it, really brief, is I am not giving up on this. I'm actually launching massive education to, team up with people like physicians and practitioners, wellness coaches, and environmental medicine doctors. So anyway, I'm so excited to share this with Dr. Sembi.
Oh, I'm so glad, Dr. Lu. So I want to just get started right at the beginning with the most important question. How does a healthy person get cancer?
Yes. So I feel all of us, right, living in this environment, breathing the air, drinking the water, and eating food that is contaminated with carcinogens on a daily basis. I believe everyone has cancer cells, right? Aging create, deranged DNA and the cancer cells. And the reason we're not all having cancer is because our immune system have been able to keep it in check. And cancer cells are very vulnerable also. Their DNA are changing all the time. And to manifest a tumor really require quite a few things. Not just a bad lifestyle today, but also emotional and spiritual aspect, why human beings are now facing this new pandemic. And we really have to look at what we have done to the planet. And our little planet is so small, many of the forever chemicals are now saturating our Earth. And so I really don't feel cancer is something that any particular individual did not do right? I think it's really the accumulation of multiple factors. But they're not that many, it's really environment interacting with your genetic, and then some lifestyle choices, we have made. And of course, to have a healthy life does not guarantee lack of disease, right? So I feel we need to change the goal instead of like, I died without any disease. Then, instead saying, can we delay the diagnosis? Can we help patients to move through the challenge we all face today? And at the end, have a better life, right? It's really living with love, meaningful relationship, and healthy planet. And that is really the goal. And I actually really changed, because before the diagnosis, I said, I just want to prevent any disease, right? And I was really living in a little bubble and thinking, by doing everything I can avoid diseases. Like my mother, she's 97, she has no disease, And my grandmother did too, and she passed away without any diagnosis except osteoporosis. But really, both of them had no cancer, no heart disease, no stroke. And I really thought I would be doing that, right? But now, looking at the planet today, children are born with 288 chemicals, right? Many of them are neurotoxins. To ask them to have no disease, by the time they're 90 is almost impossible. So that's really the switch I have made. Not because I'm giving up on preventing cancer and lowering risk, is really because I know we are being challenged to have a different paradigm, and also to honor, being human on this planet. It's not easy, because this planet is very different than 20, 50 years ago. So that's really my answer.
Right. So if toxins, environmental toxins are becoming a big problem, and the interaction of the environmental toxins with our genetics is leading to manifestation of disease such as cancer. That is one thing. And perhaps that's also the explanation why we cannot expect to get to 80 or 90 without disease, because we live in a world full of toxins. Is that why younger people are getting more diagnosed with cancer, or is there a different reason for that?
I think the younger people are definitely related to environmental toxins. That is something I feel we can do something about. I think detoxification has to start early. most people start having disease symptoms, and then they start looking at the toxicity level. I think that's a little bit too late. I think we need to detoxify, starting as young as possible. What do you mean? People say, well, what do you mean detoxification? Well, first of all, we need to do a baseline testing, because you need to look at people live in Ohio can be very different from people live in California, right? I live in California. We recently just told we don't have organic garlic anymore because the garlic has been molded. So California produce most of the vegetables that our entire nation consume. And so nuts and vegetables are mostly here. So pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, agriculture-related chemicals are more common. For example, Ventura, Santa Barbara area, that area has all these conventional strawberries. And we're seeing people having more cancer because of the pesticides, herbicides, and perchlorate, right? So doing a urine test is really very, very important because you want to make sure your area that you live in have this type of toxins that need to be detoxified, on the regular basis. Now, heavy metal are also really common, but they are more common on the East Coast. And if you look at heavy metal contamination map, there's almost like a midline, like on the East Coast, half of the United States, heavy metal are much more common than California. Now, people move around. I actually recently tested a woman. She is in her 50s. She developed some chronic fatigue syndrome, and she basically travels all over the world. She never had one place. So I just collected her urine and look at her, heavy metal. And to my surprise, because she moved around a lot, her toxins are not as high. So that's another thing. If you live in a place like in Mount Shasta for 30 years, we're looking at something like radon, by my home. We need to test for radons because it's actually pretty high, even though it's different, from here, from Redding. And we have also high altitude radiation, and aluminum level is really high in this area. So we are looking at particular area, especially if you're living there for a long time. I think those are very meaningful detoxification we can do based on your area. We also want to base on your genetic. Now, myself have no issues with detox. I don't have trouble with glutathione, salt, estrogen metabolism, and I was actually really good. That actually gave me a false sense of security. But I forgot I have methylation defect. Methylation defect is really common, and you probably have tested many people. 30% Asians, 30% of Caucasian have methylation defect. Methylation is a way DNA repair itself. So when we have those weakness, our DNA could be, damaged by flying somewhere, exposed to radiation. That could be a weakness that we have to face as well. But meanwhile, I think it's important to understand when you have the diagnosis of cancer, it's not your fault. I think that's one of the big things that people feel very ashamed. Start looking at, well, maybe I shouldn't be a vegan. Maybe I'm, too strict with my organic diet, or I exercise too much. It's really part of the human experience. And when I say human experience, I think all experience are important and very, very valuable. So we can learn something from it, and we can actually live a better life. That's really something I want to encourage everyone to say. Doesn't matter if you have cancer diagnosis or stroke. Some people have autoimmune that is so bad they can't digest food. Whatever the health challenge is, take it as a way your body teaches you a lesson. And then when you learn it, you can actually become healthier. Wouldn't that be cool? Like through a disease, you actually become healthier and happier.
I can tell you that for me personally, my diagnosis and treatment of triple negative breast cancer, I call it like this was my, of course, it was a wake up call, but it was a very good wake up call. And life has really been great. Like, it showed me things that were not clear to me before, were not obvious to me. But okay, so coming back to what we are talking about. So, what you're saying is toxins are definitely a big culprit here. And we need to understand and start recognizing and detoxing early on. So we'll come back to this, how early we should come on and how should people look into testing and strategies for detoxing. So we'll circle back on that. The thread that I want to keep following on is, okay, so younger people are getting more diagnosed. And then one other thing that you've shared with me is Asian women are getting diagnosed with cancer at higher rates. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, that actually is quite dear to me. I have met many Asian friends at UC San Francisco Mission Bay Breast Cancer Center. And most of the women that are getting treatment are Asian women. And Asian women are different because we are oftentimes very skinny. We are not the type of smoking, drinking, right? Have a bad lifestyle. We're not obese, right? And so those three factors. Also, we love exercise. I mean, I exercise every day. So we don't have the regular big four, like sedentary lifestyle, smoking, drinking, overweight, or obese. That make us very unique. So when I worked with, just having some conversation with a researcher, she's actually, I think she got an NIH grant to study Asian women. And right now, the conclusion is really the lifestyle. We delay our child bearing activity, right? Many of us don't have children. So I never had children. And I was taking birth control pill for 25 years. And so these are factors that's changing our lives, especially Asian women, in China, when they move to United States, they really want to develop their career. They delay they also realize, we have too many people on this planet. We don't really need to have all these children. So I think that's actually a big factor that increase the risk for breast cancer. So that's number one. The other thing I really feel very important after talking to so many Asian women with cancer diagnosis, some of them have Parkinson's, at a young age, is I found many women moving from Asia, like Oriental culture, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and of course the Mid East, is we are educated or systemically educated as the secondary citizen. So when we move to United States, we start to realize we're not secondary citizen, right? So, but the tradition of growing up there is so deep. I would say it's in our genetic. And suddenly it's having a conflict of our understanding of what women can do, right? So the internal conflict oftentimes are not addressed. We are taught to bury it and swallow it and just tough, just get over it, right? And that is really, really hard on our psyche. Whenever we have an internal conflict that we know that is confusing to us, our body will actually start to create clusters of tumors. It's scientific. If you ask every patient, said, 1 year or 2 year or 5 year or your childhood, do you have a sequence of traumatic event that you simply swallowed it? Because we're tough. We are simply ignoring it, right? Almost 100%, they will tell you a story of a trauma that happened that they didn't think is such a big deal. A lot of us just like, oh, that was, pretty traumatic, but I just let it go. Oftentimes Asian girls in school are bullied by, not by girls, usually by boys. And that is very, very common. And I realize many of us have that shame, right? Like we swallowed it. It must be something wrong with us. We kept it and carried it to the new country, which is United States, or to the new world, like China right now. Women are pretty much equal to men, but you find out they are not being treated as equal, even though they say they're equal, right? So there is a conflict constantly bothering us. And I think that is actually a big gift. I think we are creating new trauma healing, new understanding of the role of women for our children, for our grandchildren, for women in those Asian countries. We are creating this awareness that is so important. Recently, I have been working with a biofeedback system called the Nelson Quantum Biofeedback. And the machine actually reads the emotional conflict for you. And this equipment has been so popular in China. And women will start to cry when the machine said, look, you have a conflict here. We need to address, right? They just start to cry. And many of them releasing that, just being confirmed. This is not just in my head. This is harming my body, right? Just that alone release so much stress we bury inside of us. So I think that's another thing I learned, that emotional healing is so important in having a healthy body. And not only having a healthy body, but also having a more meaningful relationship. Because buried trauma can often reflect to difficulty in relationships with your loved ones, with your colleagues, with patients. We become people pleasers, right? We want to prove all the time because that emotional healing has never done from within. We have been giving it out and reflecting to the world in a very, how do you say, reactive way, instead of because these reactions are not very healthy. They're more about healing the trauma as a child, and we're living this adult life, trying to heal the trauma without addressing the trauma. So anyway, I think that's something I was like so happy breast cancer happened to me, because it's almost like giving me a push, giving me the courage to confront that shame. And it's not easy, because sometimes you talk to your mother and she was like, well, just don't worry about it. It's like I try to, like, it's my fault that I'm worrying about it. No, it's not. I am worrying about it. I need to bring it up. Yeah.
I'm asking the question and I'm kind of answering it myself already. Is like, okay, this conflict, women have been second-class citizens for a very long time. But, our mother's generation, our grandmother's generation, there was an illness at a young age, maybe because there was no question, there was no conflict. Like you were a second-class citizen through and through. Like there was no statement that you're equal. It was just like, you just stayed in your position and you didn't even bother, you didn't even dare to ask for something more. And now, because you can, being Asian myself, I see that this is not unique to Asian women only, though, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
America, of course, the land of opportunity, the land of equality, the land of plenty, women are not equal. We say they're equal, but we are not.
They're not.
We are not.
Right. Right.
Right? So it's interesting. There may be a genetic component. Certainly, the toxins play a part. Certainly, the inner conflict plays a part. And there may be something specifically with the Asian psyche that makes it harder on us internally. I concede that that's totally possible. And So
Yes.
younger and younger, we are getting these. So I think it's really important to educate women, to raise awareness about these things, to raise awareness about emotional healing, and that your
Right.
fear or your shame or your guilt, all of these are valid things to be examined and resolved to the extent possible. And then we come to the thing of, okay, more and more women are choosing not to have children or delaying having children. um, well, there are so many things to say about that is because, first of all, um, women don't know that the best time to have a kid is at 20, right? By the time you're in your
Exactly.
late 20s,
Yes.
you're already an old woman from a biological perspective,
Right.
right? Which woman today in her late teens or 20 or early 20s is ready to have a child because of the way our world is, the way we provide
Right.
support to women and men and boys.
Yes.
We
Yes.
it's a strange world, and so it's difficult.
Yes. Yes.
But I do want to
Yes.
talk about this thing about women being on birth control for decades, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
we
Yes.
go on this birth control for decades at a time, and they are synthetic hormones mostly, right? No one tells
Hmm.
us that we are giving you this
Right.
dosage of high dose synthetic hormones for decades. And what we are doing is effectively shutting down your finely tuned, created by nature hormonal
Right.
balance. We're shutting down your ovaries. We're
Yes.
shutting down your hormones.
Yes.
Um, and it gives us a certain freedom and autonomy, of course, because we live in this world. Because if we
Right.
didn't have that, we couldn't do the things we wanted to do. But we get this
Right.
and we pay a huge price for it unwittingly, unknowingly.
Yes.
Would you say
Yes.
something about that?
Absolutely. So I grew up in China until I was 25 years old, and I came to America. At that time, women's birth control pill, China has the one child policy, is basically IUDs. So very simple, copper IUD as soon as you get married. Okay. Everybody gets it because you can't just have a child right away. You have to be waiting for the year. They give you a year to have a child. So you basically take the IOD out and you have 1 year to get pregnant. Okay. At that time, the Chinese women have much less breast cancer, for a long time. We did not, I remember in medical school, we had 6 year medical school in China. I saw one woman with breast cancer, one. And China was pretty polluted back then. We had lots of DDTs. We probably had some heavy metal, from air pollution. But overall, the pollution is switched to more chemicals, cosmetics, and plastics. That's for sure. But just from birth control pill alone, birth control pill is a new thing. I was there. There's no birth control pill. So birth control pill, like you said, is progestin. Oftentimes has progestin, which is a carcinogen to women's uterus, and estrogen is not, natural estrogen either. So these are definitely contributing to the increase of breast cancer in women in China today. I know many, many young women in their 40s and 30s have breast cancer now in China. And I think that birth control pill started going to China recent 20, 30 years, have contributed to this increase of uterine cancer and breast cancer in women, for sure. So today, if you look back, like say my daughter, she has her family, we adopted her. Her family history of breast cancer is very strong. They're Russian descent, and both grandmother had breast cancer. And also their aunt has the BRCA gene. So for her, I tell her, if you want to do birth control, you should probably have the man do it because you already have a baby, and or have the IUD. A copper IUD is very safe, relatively safe. Everything's relative. And the Mirena is not safe because Mirena has progestin in it. And most people don't really know. They thought, everybody gets Mirena because they're more expensive, I think. And copper IUD gets a bad reputation, even though it's cheaper. It's half of the price, right? So there are lots of manipulation from the industry that they want you to have these type of birth control pill make more money, right? Because they take it every day. Instead of IUD, you just put it in. So they don't, they don't promote birth control through IUD because they made it sound really bad. And that is not true, because IUD with copper is like $250 and it lasts 7 years and you still have a period. So I think definitely advise young women to do if you are, considering having baby, but just not for now. IUD is much safer, especially the non-pharmaceutical IUD, with the physical IUD alone, on top of detoxification, of course.
Right. Okay. So let's just come back to this thing about the oral contraception in for decades, between, I don't know, 20s, 30s, 40s. You don't take it for a couple of years when you want to have your kids, but the rest of the time you are on this. And the association with in breast cancer and other negative effects. Now, the problem with that is the layperson, the average woman, doesn't know how to distinguish between those hormones and the hormones that are going to save her when she goes through menopause. Would
Right.
you say something about that? Because this is a topic near and dear to my heart, is to educate midlife women on what is the right way to think about hormones.
Yes. So I have been on the bioidentical, biorhythmic hormone replacement for 13 years. And I did it because at that time, I was 47. I have 4 people came into my, when I start asking myself what I should do, I have 4 patients. One of them is a yoga teacher, a Tai Chi, Qigong teacher. And she was 47. She had a lump in her breast and she was so healthy, right? She has no hormones. She's like, I'm just taking a wild yam cream. Dr. Lu, I'm now, in love, but I don't have any sex drive. So I measured her hormone levels. She has 0 estrogen. She has 0 testosterone, and she has tons of progesterone from the wild yam cream. Okay. And she had one of the most aggressive breast cancer. She actually died at the age 48. Now, she did delay her treatment. But she knows she had a lump for a couple of years. And, she really taught me a lesson that no hormone is not protection. No hormone actually make the cancer more aggressive, I would say. The second person is on bioidentical, very little, just, she was a nurse practitioner. We used to work together, and she had a breast cancer as well. But her breast cancer is more localized. She was doing, early screening. She got over it, right? With a very minor course of treatment. So a woman without hormone with very aggressive breast cancer and passed, right? Even though she was very healthy and skinny. The second woman is very healthy, nurse practitioner, was on bioidentical. And the third woman came in with a book called Sex, Lies, and Menopause. She just put a book on my table, said, Dr. Lu, if you do this protocol, I'll come to see you. And because she said she tried everything. So I started to learn about the biorhythmic. A certain biorhythm can actually help regulate the proliferation versus, resting, proliferation, and resting. I think that is what life cycle is. Life cycle, physiological range is much safer than a slow, small, proliferatory phase, right? Because small dose, people think small dose is safer. That is absolutely not true with hormones, because hormones are very potent at very small dose. Sometimes could be protective when the dose is really high, So hormones have double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword. You really cannot say lower dose is better because we know that. How do we know that? Well, actually, tamoxifen story is a very good story. Tamoxifen is a hormone receptor blocker to the breast receptors, right? But in other places, it's basically a hormone. It's a pharmaceutical hormone. And tamoxifen at low dose actually stimulate breast cancer. So if you decide to take tamoxifen, you really should follow the dose. You really should not take a little dose, because it actually makes the cancer worse. And that's a really good example that hormones at low dose could be more dangerous. And it's not necessarily protective. But it's very common for women say, I will just take a little bit, instead of taking, the biorhythmic. So if I want to do hormone replacement, I would definitely do biorhythmic. I think it's relatively more physiological. It has more benefit. My bone density is 24 years old. I'm 61. So, and my oncologist actually is very happy because she's like, well, your bone is so good, so we can afford to lose a little bit. But, for regular women on small dose or no hormones at all, and just relying on their adrenal gland, the osteoporosis is very, very common.
Okay, so
Definitely.
there were four
and
women.
Calcium, vitamin D doesn't really.
Right, right. What about the fourth woman, fourth case?
Yeah, the fourth case is so that we have the woman that has no hormone, a woman with bioidentical but very low dose, and a woman that want to do Wiley protocol, the biorhythmic protocol. And the fourth woman is a woman was on Premarin. Okay, it's an old lady, and she was on Premarin and she was doing great. And suddenly the WHI study came in and we stopped all the women on hormones, right? All of a sudden, just done. And she started to drive on the other side of the freeway. She totally lost it. Now that brain dysfunction happened within like 2 weeks when we stopped her Premarin. And she came back, she was like in her late 70s. She's like, Dr. Lu, I don't care. I'm almost 80. Like I can't function without hormones. So she actually continued. I gave her her Premarin back then. And she continued until she passed away in her late 80s. So again, that indicate, Premarin is not the ideal type of estrogen. We know they're from horses. They're much more potent. But in this case, she didn't have breast cancer. She had wonderful brain function, and she passed away without any cancer, with a pretty much a natural aging course.
Thank you. Yeah. So this brings the next question, which is, when there's hormone positive cancer, we do this analysis on how weakly or strongly positive it is, right? Because if we want to evaluate, should you start HRT? Should you start, rhythmic physiological dosing? How would you guide somebody, on how weakly or strongly positive they are? Should they wait until they finish treatment? Should they wait for 5 years after treatment? How does the Oncotype DX or Mammaprint or whatever breast cancer index? And of course, we are not going to, we're not giving somebody an algorithm on how to decide, but the high level, how do you approach this decision making? Because there will be times when it may be prudent to stop hormones, at least for a while. And I would love for you to share that.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I'm asking myself every day. So what I like to do is I have a panel of blood. I actually like to look at my panels, and I want to make sure my body is completely healthy. I have a very healthy immune system, right? So that's called a snapshot of how you are doing as a person. The secondary thing is I do think with liquid biopsy, today Medicare even pays for Signatera, which is basically look at your tumor, your biomarkers, and then plug it into a massive data system. And I think that's important because everything we do has a risk. Seriously, walking out of the house, you can get run over by a car, right? Everything we don't do also have a risk. If you don't take hormones, for example, if you have a very strong family history of dementia, and that could be very, very bad. So I think we have to weigh the risk and the benefit. So I would definitely look at my snapshot, how healthy I am. And then the second one, look at the tumor. Are you estrogen receptor positive? What made the tumor happen? For me, it was the p53 damage. P53 damage are related later on to COVID, the repeated S protein exposure, either from vaccines or from repeated COVID. Some people have 3 COVID, they keep having COVID. That is also repeated exposure to S protein. S protein can cause p53 dysfunction. We now know. My tumor also have the PD-1 overexpression, which is clearly related to immune dysfunction. PD-1 protein is expressed on tumor cells, also on your cytotoxic T cells. What is PD-1? Is basically if you have a tumor, you have your immune system fighting the tumor, the PD-1 is like something in between, okay? So your cytotoxic T cells cannot engage the fighting. That's what PD-1 is. Now, you can measure through cellular analysis, we call flow cytometry, to see how much your immune system have overexpression of PD-1. And recently, there is more and more study coming out, especially in lung cancer cells. They found out people with repeated vaccine actually have more PD-1 expression on their lung cancer cells. And of course, those people are very good candidate for Keytruda, which is the PD-1 remover, right? Monoclonal antibody. And that's the one I had treatment. So with today's modern technology, we can look at the tumor and find out why you have tumor, right? Mm-hmm. So are we addressing that? We're removing the PD-1 with Keytruda. We are, the p53 damage is real, so you have to be on alert. What is p53? That is the guardian of your genome. It is so important. It controls your cell cycle. So if your tumor cell have that damage, that is pretty concerning, right? You want to also look at estrogen receptor mutation that can also be found through this liquid biopsy. And then you kind of evaluate the risk versus benefit. If you have low expression of the estrogen receptor, maybe less than 70% or only 50% or 30%, even though you are positive, your cancer being stimulated by estrogen is probably lower than people they have high expression, like 90%. So then you kind of weigh the risk and benefit. If you do want to get treatment from hormones, like I have quite a few patients actually had breast cancer and got on the biorhythmic. And one of them, she's now in her 70s. She had reoccurrence in 15 years, right? But she also did not finish chemo because she had, leukopenia and sepsis. So she didn't really finish the chemo. So she has some parts she didn't finish that also gave her reoccurrence rate, not the hormone replacement. But she had 15 years of really good life. And when the tumor reoccurred, it's clearly related to an environmental disaster, which is wildfire in California. And she had, mastectomy this time. And she did not have very aggressive tumor. Does it make sense? So the hormone therapy did not make the reoccurrence more prominent and did not make her cancer more aggressive. That's actually, we were discussing it with Dr. Taguchi because she has been watching people, without hormone, with a little bit of hormone, with biorhythmic, and the reoccurrence rate in 20 years, there's no difference among 3 groups. So now we have better technology to look at, liquid biopsy and look at circulating tumor cells. These things we can monitor closer, and we can also monitor the carcinogens. For me, my level of BPA was really high, and BPA is basically estrogen receptor. It's a pharmaceutical estrogen. Initially, it was developed by a pharmaceutical company for hormone replacement. But then they found out it's caused breast cancer, gallbladder issues. So they put it away. They didn't pass the animal phase of testing. Then the food packaging industry took over the BPA. And suddenly BPA is in everybody's blood, is in our clothing, is in our cookware, is in the can, is in the airplane receipt, all these things. So I have been monitoring BPA level, and for me to lower it to as much as you can, to the green level instead of high level, which give you more chance of going around your body. And I think that's really something we can do also, getting the toxin down, address your emotional hangups and conflicts, and choose a very safe biorhythmic hormone replacement, monitoring the metabolites. So, a lot of things I missed. I have to tell you, I did my urine test for the estrogen metabolism, and I had clearly 16 hydroxy more, which is the harmful estrogen. I just ignored it. So now I learned my lesson. I think people should look at it. You don't have to look at it all the time, but once you are on the rhythm, you need to monitor the metabolism. You need to keep the environmental toxin low. You need to address any emotional conflicts. That is actually no longer difficult. Back probably 5 years ago, I would be clueless, right? I'll be like, I don't know. I don't have any emotional conflicts. I'm so positive. I love my life. I'm very grateful for everything. The subconscious level of conflict can be now discovered. Some of them by biofeedback system that we are, becoming more and more available. Some of them, I learned how to watch the patterns. When you have because 95% of reactive patterns in life are controlled by subconscious conflicts. And I actually have symptoms. Now, what are the symptoms? Let's say I tried to take care of a patient, and the patient said, you're no good. You're just a lousy practitioner, or the patients are very demanding. My desire to prove to the patient, to please everyone, to my way is the best way. That is very, very clear pattern. And, people say, what does it mean? Well, if it's not healthy pattern, there's something behind it, okay? And if you are with your really good friend, somebody you can trust, I would say, ask your friend, say, look, I want you to point out something I do in my life when I interact with other people. Could you give me some clue? There's something that is not quite right? You have to find a good friend. You can't find just anybody, because then you can get hurt, your self-esteem, all that. Find somebody you can trust. Find a safe place. Sometimes I think psychotherapy is important. People always think, oh, psychotherapy is for mentally ill people. No, psychotherapy should be done with everyone, because that is somebody can see you, somebody professionally can help you to resolve those subconscious issues in a very safe environment. I think that area need to be addressed. And I think it's a good thing, because it's not just preventing cancer, it's making your life better too. So now we talk about 3 prevention, right?
Yes.
So looking at your estrogen metabolism, environmental toxins, and emotional issues.
Yes. So I want to close the loop on one thing here, which is that if the degree of weak or strong hormone receptor positivity, if we are
Yes,
saying that your cancer is strongly positive, meaning it's desperately looking for estrogen, right?
right.
And so from that perspective, you would think that, okay, you would benefit by biorhythmic hormone, right? And if it is weakly positive, right? Or if it is triple negative, then then that cancer is not looking for estrogen so much. It's just a different kind of mutation, but not from a lack of estrogen in the body. But still, you have to take all these other considerations into mind in terms of what's your P53, what's your PD-1, what's your estrogen metabolism and all that, and then make that decision.
Correct. I do believe triple negative patients can safely, they should be hormone replacement. I think this triple negative is different from, estrogen receptor positive cancers.
Right. No, I totally understand.
Yeah.
So coming back to the role of spike protein for a moment, right? So what you touched on is that the spike protein is can make damage the P53 and increase the expression of PD-1. And that is directly related to increased manifestation of cancer. But would also be other chronic illness.
Yes. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is before the lump appeared, I had my booster. And after the booster, I started losing hair. And so that was very shocking, right? So I decided to test my hormone level. This is when I was still on the biorhythmic, not high dose, basic biorhythmic dosing. My hormone levels are always within good range, never really high. I would say physiological range, right? Like day 21, my estrogen was 221. For most people would say that's high, but that's really a physiological range. When I started losing hair, I got my hormone tested. And that was also 3 months after the booster. Okay. So my estrogen level was 46,000 and my progesterone was 780 on day 21, testosterone 780. I was not even on testosterone. My testosterone was in the 700s. My IGF-1 was 395. And as you look at this profile, it's highly proliferative. Okay. Now people say, well, maybe you're using more hormones, but I was using the same amount of hormone and I was not using testosterone and human growth hormone. And why this proliferative, they're wonderful anti-aging hormones, right? But they are above the physiological range. They're like super pregnant. And that has to do, my lifestyle is the same. I live in Mount Shasta, I eat organic food, I'm a vegan. I don't eat any animal protein because sometimes they can be loaded with hormones, right? They can be loaded with human growth hormone, not human growth hormone, bovine, HGH. I was not having those exposures. Why all my proliferative hormone went sky high? We talk about this, like women start having heavy period after the vaccine or the COVID. There definitely patients have never had vaccine. They start having period dysregulation. So there's definitely a connection between estrogen metabolism and progesterone and testosterone and human growth hormone and the COVID event. So COVID virus is something that's different from a flu. And I'm telling you this because we're watching all these phenomena that seems to be this virus has multiple system functions, and disrupting sex hormone metabolism is one of them. I'm sure if we do a ChatGPT or Google search, now we're seeing more and more cases. Hopefully, physicians are measuring hormone levels now because estrogen is protective. Like I never had COVID. I had probably one time, just one day. And they talk about estrogen is protective, right? I don't know if you remember when the COVID first started, we were thinking to give men estrogen because women don't have a serious disease. And then we're looking at how estrogen can protect the COVID infection from going crazy. And estrogen is an immune modulator. Estrogen is controlling mostly Th1, the cellular immunity. So maybe the increase is the body's response to the external stimulants of an immune challenge. And I think that's one of the things we really need to start to acknowledge. And the tumor is different. My delaying of the whole year is because I was doing all kinds of thermogram, biological testing, and looking at the lump, and it's cold. It's not even hot, right? So it's different. And I tell all my friends that are in integrated medicine, holistic, and I said, you got to look at this tumor differently because they're not the same. And that is a new challenge. And it's very humbling. I'm not saying they're wrong. I think that the holistic ways is still a good thing to help your body. But you got to look at this thing different because there's something very strange about the COVID vaccine and COVID virus, that affecting the cancer epidemic for sure. On top of the environmental toxins and emotional stuff. And I think we're facing a new disease. I really do. I think there's a new disease happening.
Okay, that's fascinating because, and I will do some more research on this to see what I can find. I don't know if I can ask you this question or not, and if you're not okay answering, that's totally okay. But could you help me understand what made you decide to go off of the rhythmic hormones?
Yes. So in my first year when I had the tumor, and Julie told me I need to have a biopsy, and I decided not to have biopsy because I thought this tumor biopsy is going to spread tumor, So for the whole year, I was on biorhythmic, and she didn't even know I was still on it. And I did lots of acupuncture. I did some herbs to help the lymphatic drainage. And my scan, with some of the thermal imaging indicating more cardiovascular challenge than the tumor challenge. So I was treating the wrong imbalance. And then the tumor actually grow double the size. So initially it was 2.5 centimeter and it went to 5 centimeter. And that was the second time I saw Julie. And she actually did the exam in the sauna. She said, Shanhong, you really should get a biopsy and you should stop the hormone. And that was really the decision I made to stop the hormone. And then during the initial immunotherapy for 3 months, the tumor shrink, by 50%, like one shot. That really indicate it's an immune dysfunction, not the hormone-related thing. But because it shrinks so fast, we assume that the stopping maybe is helpful also. So anyway, that was why I was off for a whole year. And now is the second year, right? And because of the tumor disappeared in the breast after the treatment, but the lymph nodes you still have a disease. So I went on radiation and now I'm on letrozole. So letrozole is a big time aromatase inhibitor. My oncologist is Dr. Rugo, and she is like, Shanhong, this is something I want you to stay on as long as you can. Now I'm on it for 5 months. I started to learn everything about menopause. Like I never had menopause before, Suddenly I'm like, okay, I need to find an alternative way to address this. But it is something so valuable because I never went through menopause. I started the biorhythmic at age 47 all the way to 61, right? Great bone density, wonderful brain function. And now I'm going through menopause suddenly. Like I am definitely honoring all the conversation, right? I think it's really important. The decision is still changing and it's in the gray zone. I have to tell everyone, it is definitely in the gray zone. And that's just being honest. But I do feel by lowering the toxins, addressing the emotional issues, and really kind of give yourself a space to think, to try your best. I always tell people you can always do your best, but there's no guarantee. There's absolutely no guarantee. People don't do anything, have cancer. People do everything, like Suzanne Summer, have cancer. And so sometimes you just have to say, we are part of the ocean. We're just little waves, and we can't guarantee we're not part of it. I just feel like when I didn't have cancer, I talk about cancer prevention, right? I talk about hormone replacement. And then I got cancer. And the degree of learning and understanding is like 100,000 times more when you just tell your patient what to do, right? So I think the gray zone is okay. Sometimes the most discovery is done when you are in the gray zone.
Well said. Well said. I agree with you. I want to come back to the question we had said that we'll put it to the side, and then and we've been talking now for a while, so I want to respect your time. Um, what test would you like to like? I know you said you do urine testing for figuring out your toxins, and there's a bunch of labs that we can do urine testing, and there's no provocation for that. You just take the test and have your practitioner interpret it for you, um, and then start early. You say, start learning your burden of toxins early and have a lifestyle that promotes detox, right? Would you add anything to that? Yeah.
I think what you said is really, really important because now we have labs. Back 20 years ago, we don't know how to measure these toxins. And now we have, Vibrant America is a lab. They even add the hormone profile with BPA in it. So I think it's such a great advancement in laboratory medicine is we're looking at those things. Also, I think PD-1 expression because of the COVID phenomena, that could be also evaluated now. People can get the blood. We're looking for the lab. Cyrex is the lab I have been contacting, said, hey, you're looking at PD-1 expression, T cells. Why don't we just add that? I think those things are really important because it's so common now. And PD-1 expression is not a bad thing because if you do have PD-1 expression, the treatment are wonderful. You can get rid of it. And then you can overcome what we call T cell fatigue. It's actually quite common. T cell fatigue is one of the reasons the tumors start growing so fast, right? Because our T cells are now seeing the tumor. We call the turbo tumor. And people say, oh, that's not real, but it's totally real in my case, It literally popped up overnight. So we have to accept certain things are real because a lot of people just in denial. They said we have better, mammogram. That's why we have more breast cancer. That is just not true. My colleagues sometimes say that.
Right. There's so many other questions to consider in terms of long COVID, the repercussions of COVID, how to address some of those, talk a little bit more about perhaps the PD-1 expression and treatment, what else can be done, and perhaps we can do a part two of the conversation at some point.
Oh, I would love that. I
Okay.
think that will be something so important because this is a national, international phenomena, right? We're not just addressing United States. We're looking at China, Hong Kong, Japan. So, and your country, your area too. So I think it's a very important topic. It's not a political topic. It's not a political thing. It's absolutely something we have to look.
We can stop here today and then we'll schedule some time for part two of our conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Lu. This was wonderful. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to another one soon.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.